Welcome back to Recipe to Revenue. I'm your host, Leah Messina. I am so excited to be here today with Seth Alexander. He comes to us from Barrel Age Management. We are going to dive into the world of hospitality today. And, Seth, going out to eat and staying at a hotel has always been some of my favorite parts of just experiencing life, right? And it's changed a lot in the last couple of years, but I still love showing up at a hotel. I love the design. I love the feel that you get, the restaurants there. This is your world, right? So tell us how you
Oh
get
yeah,
into
it's
it.
it's it's almost like transportation, right? Like when you go from one place to another and you walk in and I think it's one of those exciting things. You're like somewhat apprehensive. You really know exactly what you're walking into, right? And
Yeah,
sometimes it's just like, it goes above and beyond. And the other times, it becomes a little bit more of an adventure.
right.
But, it's still definitely one of my favorite things to do is to walk into a hotel room. And, now that I have kids, seeing the pureness of their reaction. They
Hmm.
run in and they're jumping around and they're exploring like every little nook and cranny,
Yeah,
being able to have that like same excitement, which I still probably have to a certain respect.
right.
But it's funny to see it like in its purest form.
Yeah, yeah. And there's something about if a hotel, when you come into the lobby and they have like really cool seats or chairs, like as a kid, you're jumping on those chairs,
Oh,
like
everything.
100%. Yeah,
To my day, I am still like to this day, I'm still a huge fan of like, the armchair,
yeah,
right? Like if I see it and it's just a recliner or it's a bucket, I'm literally like walking around sitting everything to this
yeah.
day. My wife laughs at me, but it's just it's a different experience every time. And that's I think the best part about, hospitality
Hmm.
is in its end, it's like usually the same DNA, but just in different locations and markets, right? And
Right.
everybody does it a little differently. I think most of us have the same goals. So yeah, listen, it's a great experience, right?
Yeah. So how did you get into this field? What was your start?
Well, I was kind of born into hospitality in a way. My grandfather owned Jewish delis when I was
Hmm.
younger. My mom, a single mom, shout out, put
Hmm.
herself through law school.
Wow.
And, as you could imagine, that takes a lot of time. So, during our summers, we used to go from where we lived in Texas to South Florida to visit our grandparents basically for the
Hmm.
summer.
Yeah.
It was almost 2 or 3 months at a time.
Yeah.
And one of my grandfathers was a deli owner, and my
Hmm.
other grandfather was a developer. So I kind of sat like in this very
Yeah.
interesting kind of place since I was younger. The grandfather that was a developer, I think he was ahead of his time.
Hmm.
Back then it was still retail,
Yeah.
but he always loved having one food and beverage, location or outlet or tenant in his shopping centers, right? He
Hmm.
always said to me, it brought a heartbeat to
Yeah.
to his developments. And I think to this day, right? I think we see it more and more now that, obviously 5, 10 years ago, retail kind of broke its ankle, right? And at the same time, I think hospitality really grew. And now, I have to agree. I think we are like the heartbeat of any development, whether it's a hotel
Hmm.
or a multi-use. We've seen it in the financial side of, two comparable hotels, even next door. One has a destination location. They're able to charge a higher ADR, right? In
Hmm.
comparison to say something that doesn't have a destination or a signature restaurant, and it's more of like an amenitized food and beverage, that you just don't have the same capture rate, nor can you charge the
Hmm.
same ADRs, but you also get that different feeling, right? Like
Yeah.
when you walk in and just like you said, a buzzing lobby and a busy restaurant, feels very different than walking into, what I would call like the cafeteria, right? Or
Yeah.
like the buffet at your local select hotel. So yeah, I was basically raised in it. And, I think by the time I was around 12 or 13, my grandfather with the deli started to expand,
Hmm.
right? So he had a guest that wanted to be an investor, and he brought in my uncle, and they just started to select different locations and do build outs, and it was just kind of a fun way to spend my time and,
Yeah.
everything from, and this was,
You're getting a
obviously,
little internship every summer with
yeah,
her.
it
Yeah.
was a long time ago, right? This is like
Yeah.
you're hiring the Rockwells and the Meyer Davis.
Hmm.
You're basically going to your local, I don't even remember at the time, but to today, your Targets, your Home Goods, to kind of find like little niches, little knickknacks and things like that to
Right.
go more authentic. So it was kind of a fun, yeah, definitely a fun experience. And then my
Hmm.
my other grandfather, who was a developer, started going outside of just shopping centers and building multi-use complexes and vertical
Hmm.
buildings, and just kind of hearing his thought process back then
Yeah.
on why you should have an F&B tenant even though they can't afford the leases of these corporate retail giants
Yeah.
at the time. And now it's just interesting to see that now, that's basically like, the norm, right? If not like
Hmm.
the formula, if one would say. So I was able to kind of get like a pretty interesting education very young
Yeah.
at, food and beverage being someone's passion and kind of lifeline, and another one looking at it as more of like an amenitized asset, right? To increase the value of a property. They never did business together,
I
which
was
I
going to
thought
ask,
was
that was
kind
going
of
to be my
funny.
next
They never
question. Did the
did.
grandpas ever team up?
They never did. And I think mostly that was because, funny enough, one was my biological, one was my step, same grandmother. So I'm assuming that had probably something
Yeah.
to do with
Okay.
it.
Okay. Fair enough.
But yeah, they never did business together.
Hmm.
And, but, I've always kind of thought of hospitality as a family business, right? So like
Yeah.
every time, I was in operations for a long period, every time we do a project now, we really look at it as that. It sounds
Hmm.
cliche, but I think the ones that treat, and you could say like family and depending on what your family relationship is, but, treating someone more than an employee number, right?
Hmm.
I think those are the projects and the brands that really do well,
Yeah.
whatever your definition of that is, creating career paths or, a slingshot to, to more of a life goal of someone, right? Someone coming in as a
Hmm.
prep cook who really wants to be a chef. I think being able to
Yeah.
provide like those opportunities
Right. A pathway.
and not necessarily just like the analytical option of providing it, right? Being like, if you
Hmm.
work hard, you do this, but actually like understanding what someone needs and
Hmm.
what their goals actually are and kind of helping them get there.
Right.
I think that's it's priceless, right?
Hmm.
And that's when you see people who are 10, 20, 30 year, vets of a company, is
Sure.
because it's not just necessarily a solidified, consistent job, but it becomes a give and take, right? In a
Hmm.
post-COVID world, we really realize it is a give and take relationship now.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, so much that has changed with COVID and being in the hospitality space. Tell us a little bit about how things have, from what they were then to where we're at now. What are the biggest takeaways?
If I had to be, I'd say like number one, I say with is our talent pool.
Hmm.
Similar to like the crash of '08. We've lost an entire generation of knowledge and experience.
Yeah.
Like the people who were vice presidents, directors, regionals, senior directors, you know, around the COVID time, they were all let go, right? And most
Yep.
of them did not come back, right? They either went into
Hmm.
sales or they decided to change industries. And, it kind of left this huge gap between like the C level and the property level operators, right?
Hmm.
Which is why I think nowadays, you'll see assistant general managers that are directors, right? Like
Okay.
you'll see this gap within the experience and just overall knowledge of the industry that's just missing now, right? So I
Hmm.
think the
Hmm.
number one is, we lost that opportunity of mentorship that used to be more of like trickle down experience and knowledge. I mean, don't get
Right.
me wrong. I got in the industry before, it really became kind of the educational route.
Hmm.
I think it's great to be able to get a degree and, even a master's, within hospitality, but we all know like any job, right, is like the hands-on experience is priceless. It's kind of
Sure.
what you need to set yourself apart, which is why we do internships and
Hmm.
stages and things like that. But nowadays it's like we've lost that real transfer of knowledge.
Hmm.
And I think that's become a huge inhibitor for our business.
Yeah. It's not like there's like courses you could go take necessarily, or here's the best book to read and to be all caught up and ready to
Right.
go.
Right, because even and it's sad, as I think like also one of the largest things since COVID is our formulas are broken. Like if
Yes.
I still go into projects and they're looking for a rent between 5 and 10%. They're looking at food costs at 30%. They're looking at labor at 30%. They're looking at prime costs. They're hoping to be somewhere around the 70. And like those formulas don't work anymore, right? Like
Right.
to be able to get a 5 to 10% lease is fantastic actually nowadays. I
Hmm.
haven't seen that like forever. I haven't seen a labor below a 30% in 3 4 years. And it's
Hmm.
just that I think people were you know we've been we've been educated to hit these milestones and these goals and these percentage markers of margins that are from an outdated market, right? It's an outdated
Yeah.
environment. And I think that like since COVID, a lot of those things have changed and we haven't adapted to what that new formula is.
Hmm.
And I'd say, to be honest, I don't think there is a formula anymore. I think it really
Okay.
depends a lot on, what your position is, and how you benefit. We talk about hotels, for example. If you're utilizing a restaurant as an anchor, right, and you're able to offer a higher ADR and you're getting a larger occupancy, well, then the profitability of your restaurant skews a little bit. If you're a brick and mortar who signed a 10-year lease with 5-year options, you have a very different formula than that hotel.
Hmm.
If you're a multi-use, like what just happened in New York with the market at Seaport, right? Like in a situation like that, they were the anchor. They were
Yeah.
looking for office tenants and they were looking for entertainment, right? So like you really became like an amenity, even though you had the NoHo Hospitalities and the Mamafucos and the John
Hmm.
Georges, all in this area. They really weren't looked at the same way. They weren't. Those were very interesting strategic partnerships with Howard Hughes because there was a greater goal,
Yeah.
right? It's hard to take all of that and then put, restaurants for dummies on what
Hmm.
these margins should be, right? Like
Right.
everything has kind of changed. So I think that's like kind of number two. I think COVID,
Yeah.
really put a spotlight that, these margins and these formulas don't work anymore. And you
Yeah.
really have to be more hands-on and creative in your strategy and P&Ls.
Hmm.
I'd say three, I think the style of eating has changed, right?
For
Obviously within
sure.
wellness, I think that, COVID did give I won't necessarily use the term too often, but like the foodies, quote
Hmm.
unquote, they become more educated,
Yeah.
right? Where prior to COVID, people weren't cooking as much. It's like the city of New York, right? Like how many people
Yeah.
cook,
Everything is
COVID,
at your
right?
fingertips, right?
All of a sudden, you have COVID and they're like, oh my God, I have a kitchen in this apartment,
Yeah. I got
right?
to figure out
Like,
how to use it.
how do I use
What
this?
does this air fryer thing do?
Right. They're like, so people are starting to learn about ingredients and they're starting to learn how to
Yeah.
cook and they're starting to look at the different flavor profiles and like what's going in their food. And I think that changed our customer, our guest. Right. And
Hmm.
I think that, within a lot of, and I'll just call them mom and pop or like smaller brick and mortars, they had to adapt. Right. It didn't necessarily just become, I think prior to COVID, the biggest trend was convenience,
Hmm.
right? Like people didn't necessarily go to signature sit down restaurants for lunch. They went to, the Chops and they went to the
Hmm.
QSRs and it was like, how fast can I get my lunch? And,
Right.
I think it really became like very convenience focused. And then after COVID, I think people started saying, well, like, wait, life is short, right? If I'm taking an hour lunch break, I want to go and I want to enjoy my lunch,
Right.
you know? And I do think that, probably number four of COVID is just I would call it like the dynamic pricing, right?
Mm.
People, you go to a QSR and you go to a bistro and you're pretty much spending the same amount of money, right?
Yeah.
Like here in Miami, you could go to a Pura Vida, which is, a wellness QSR, and you could
Hmm.
spend $60 on a lunch for
Right.
yourself, right? And
Yeah.
that's just pretty much, a coffee, a smoothie, and a salad,
Yeah.
right? But then in New York, you could go to, something like Fish Cheeks and you could spend $60, right? So like,
Hmm.
I think the pricing is very out of whack right now. And I think that,
100%.
that is leading to a lot of closures and people are focusing more on the closure as opposed to why it closed, right?
Yeah.
Like we had this restaurant Armageddon in Miami, but yet you see more Michelin star restaurants, more international placements, more restaurants opening, and some are extremely successful, some are not. And, they blame that on the competition. However, our price gap is probably like 10 to 20% from the nicest restaurant
Yeah.
to the local bistro. They're still charging almost the same. So, how do you compete with that? And I think that people, post COVID, they realized during COVID, we can kind of charge what we want right now.
Mm-hmm.
And they became very reliant on that formula, also realizing that their traditional formula and margins don't work. So they're keeping those prices. And now they're starting to see people become conscious of that,
Yeah.
right? Especially with grocery stores being extremely expensive. You start thinking, well, why am I going to go out and spend $200 on groceries when I can go out and spend $75 on lunch, right? Or on
Yeah.
dinner,
It all
because the
feels
same ingredients, right?
very up in the air. Like it's
So it
very hard to
becomes
make
this
a,
very,
logical
yeah,
decision.
it's very challenging because you used to eat at home to save money.
Right.
You used to go to your local cafe or bistro because it wasn't as expensive as your,
Exactly.
what I would call fine dining restaurant. And I mean, fine dining now is
Mm-hmm.
different, but your destination restaurant. And now it's like all kind of the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you really start to think like, well, if it's going to cost me the same, what is our guest looking for, right? Are they looking for
Mm-hmm.
convenience? Are they looking for proactive service? Are they looking for ambiance, environment, music, service?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really post COVID, it's just very important to understand who you're targeting and why, and like
Mm-hmm.
creating your strategy based on that, as opposed to I'm going to cook good food and people will come, right?
Yeah.
That's just, don't get me wrong. I reminisce of the times when it was like that, but now it's
Yeah.
not. Now
Those days are gone.
there's so many other things. So I think those four things post COVID has definitely changed the way that hospitality runs. And I
Yeah.
think it gives us, a little bit of a challenge into like, how are we going to adapt to that?
Who do you think is best positioned to make it out of this mess?
I'd say largest sector is the educated operator, right? And when I say educated, I don't necessarily mean like,
A degree.
right, a degree or even experience, but just people
Mm-hmm.
who really understand like their business.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things that we say to a client or ask a client is, what's your daily break even? And I've
Mm-hmm.
been on a few podcasts and I talk about this a lot because, it's one of those questions that 90% cannot answer.
Yeah.
They'll be like, oh, well, we know what our monthly is, or we know what our annual P&L or projection. And you're like, no, your daily break even.
Yeah.
And when we say daily, it's not the average of the seven, it's every single day. What is the day to day break even?
Yeah.
Because, once we start to like identify these things and dive in and do some due diligence, most people start to realize that like their Tuesdays and their Wednesdays and their Thursdays are actually more profitable than their Fridays and their Saturdays.
Mm-hmm.
People don't realize that, volume kind of clouds everything. People will see
Mm-hmm.
a busy restaurant, or ownership will, see a busy happy hour and say, well, I don't understand why I'm not making money. And you're like, well, it's double the labor, right? It's double the food
Mm-hmm.
cost, it's lower margins. And, all of these things, they equate to your bottom line, right? Where like they'll say,
Sure.
well, wait, on a Wednesday, we do so much better. And you're like, well, on a Wednesday, you have a more educated diner. You have
Mm-hmm.
people who are spending more money. You have less staff. You spent less promoting or marketing that day, right? So like your profitability on that day is more than your Saturday. How are you
Right.
going to adjust? So I think like that becomes one of the most important things. And the people who understand really, when I say the educated operator, when they really understand all of the resources they have, like their
Mm-hmm.
systems, obviously, like, your resis, your reserves, your open tables, your restaurant 365s, your,
Yeah.
all these different things. And most people just really kind of scratch the surface of it. But there's so much information and resources that we have now. And, I think the educated operator can now compete with the larger conglomerate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the independent boutique operator can now compete with a Marriott because you don't need a room of, 20 researchers to run analytics for you, right? It
Yeah.
could be one person and a great AI program. So like there's a lot of opportunity to use what's available to us. And most people don't do it. And it's not necessarily, I think, because they don't want to or they don't have time. It's just they're not educated in all of the systems.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started, like I said, when I was in the deli, we used manual chits for our tickets.
Sure.
We wrote something down,
Yeah.
stuck it in a
Suck it
spiel, and
in.
we
Yep.
spun it.
Yep.
You wrote down a check and you're using just a digital cash register, right? And like now, we have POS systems and KDS systems, and we have Avero. You can find your numbers from across the world, right? There's like so many things that we have, and the technology is changing so quickly. And I think ownership groups get very excited, so they're constantly changing and adapting, but they're not really training people how to use it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like that education is, once you fully understand like your arsenal, your briefcase, I think those people are going to have the most amount of success in today's market. And it's every sector, corporate sector, boutique
Sure.
sector, independent brick and mortar, mom and pop. I think the ones that really dig into understanding the business that they do, why they're doing it, who they're targeting, and what resources either they currently have or could have
Yeah.
that can help, bring volume, success, cut margins. I think everyone still nowadays, I'll never talk negative, but like the traditional asset manager, they come in and they cut labor, they cut costs, which usually affects quality. They
Right.
raise price point. And to me, that is the formula of closure,
Yeah.
right? The second people start to cut their labor, cut their quality, and raise their prices, you're pretty
Those
much
are the three things that a restaurant guest will notice first, right? I waited at my table too long for my food. The prices were higher and the portion was smaller.
right. And then you don't go back. And I think that, at that point, right, then that traditionally takes a month run. And then,
Mm-hmm.
your asset manager will come in and say, well, okay, we should try this activation and this
Yeah.
promotion, and let's change the menu to A, B, C, and D. But now you don't have the staff to do it,
Right.
right? So now the people on the ground, like in the property level, they're like, well, why didn't we do this when we had all the people
We had people,
before
yeah,
we
to
did
support it.
this part of it,
Yeah.
right? Because now this is going to take, I want you to cost out 10 new dishes, and I want you to create an entirely new marketing campaign. And they're like, well, great. So that's going to take all of my time.
Mm-hmm.
Who's actually going to be doing the operations right now?
Yeah.
Right. And that's where we kind of found our gap. We consider ourselves, we call ourselves asset performance, right? So we're like a development and asset performance studio. So, we help create the strategies, but then we can also execute, right? So like we'll bring in that team to either work side by side with your operators, or we'll work directly with ownership. And then once the formula and strategy is complete, we'll go to the property level and train the staff how to do it.
Right.
So, unlike I think most like consultants, most operators enjoy having us as part of the formula, right? Because we don't tell them to do the work, we do the work, right? Like we'll do it for them. And then after we do it and we perfect it and we streamline it, we make sure it's efficient, then we teach them how to do it.
Yeah, because you
And,
created a system for them at that point.
right. And then when we bring on a new system, like say, we went from Open Table to say Resi, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't say, oh, well, here's the webinar, go on and read this, watch this for 30 minutes.
Yeah.
We'll sit down and we'll say, don't worry about that 2 hour, demo. Let us show you like the hands-on in real skills. This is everything you're going to need. You're actually never going to use these 5 pieces over here.
Yeah.
But this is the stuff you should focus on from like more of the lens of an operator. And it kind of just gets rid of some of the noise and you can go directly to it. And, usually that empowers the team, right? Now they're like, okay, like I understand how to do this and, let me figure out. And sometimes they come to us with great ideas, right? They're like, oh, I geeked out last night for an hour on this and we can do A, B, and C. So it becomes very collaborative. And I think that's probably the foundation for the people who are going to succeed, the ones who truly understand how their business is run and use everything that's out there.
So, with so much data available now, and I see this with my marketing clients too, people are like, well, what do I need to pay attention to is usually the first question, kind of like you're saying. And then the second thing is, what do you tell your clients about like what to do with the data? They're getting information from their POS, they have their website analytics, their social analytics, their everything else. How do they pull so much data together? Where do you recommend they do that? And then who should be kind of crunching the numbers to find the most profitable day?
Good question. It depends on the operation, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're a hotel, traditionally we try to empower like the department heads. So if
Hmm.
it's, like marketing, for example, you know, we pretty much try to give them the roadmap of, okay, like these are the systems, these are the reporting, these are the tools. Chef, same thing, front of house.
Yeah.
And then really kind of explaining to your operator, whether it's a general manager or director, taking the time to give them the opportunity to review these things.
Hmm.
We've sat in, roundtables where you have every department head, and it's an hour long, and everybody's trying to get in all the information.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult, that's a difficult setup, right? Is
Yeah.
like how much information can someone really retain in 1 hour between, 4 or 5 different departments? And obviously there's debates on like meetings, right? Like nowadays with, meetings are a waste of time and
Yeah.
etc. You can call them downloads, you can call them whatever it is, but like I think allocating time to each one of your department heads real time, not looking at your phone, right?
Yeah.
Like you're talking because 30 minutes with a department head as opposed to a roundtable is going to get you real information.
Yeah.
So usually we say, in that situation, your department head. If it's a smaller operation and you're trying to consolidate information, I think you have to kind of point out you know, where your soft spots are, right? If you have the volume, then marketing may not necessarily be like the most important thing
Hmm.
to dedicate your time to at that moment.
Right.
Again, I always think that if you're paying someone, let them do their job. Don't tell them how to do it. Give them the
Hmm.
opportunity to explain it, or at least give them the opportunity to walk you through what their strategies are, right? That's
Right.
worth whatever it is you're paying on an annual basis. If
Sure.
not, it really is a waste of money.
Hmm.
If say, for example, your volume is good, but your margins are bad, well, then you know what? You need to spend more time with your operators and allow your operators to kind of go through, run P mixes, look at your costing. And there's really not that many things. There's tools that can help people get that information in different ways. So,
Yeah.
I traditionally say, if you're a multi-unit operator, try to solidify what these systems are company wide so everybody can actually utilize and use each other as resources to get the best information.
Hmm.
But for us, it's saying, well, listen, find out what your soft spot is. Look at what that exact formula is, right? So if it's your margin, it's going to be your purchasing power, your costing, your product mix, your labor, right?
Yeah.
So in that situation, we say we'll gather those and do one meeting where everybody is kind of working within that. Um, if it's something, say, for example, where I love a system like an Avero or that consolidates information.
Yeah. I love a good dashboard.
Good dashboard. Big hot topic obviously now is with AI.
Yeah.
Like we've created, we have like our own kind of. We were lucky enough to kind of be in the forefront of it. I just found it like very interesting in the very
Hmm.
beginning. But you can train an AI bot to aggregate information, right? So you can
Hmm.
feed it to one bot that can consolidate this information in a report that's easier for us to read,
Yeah.
right? So I'd say, for example, if you're a brick and mortar or a mom and pop and you are suffering in all categories, market margins, pricing, I think having these reports, feeding it to an AI bot that can give you that information is a valuable tool. I don't think having AI make decisions for you is the best
Sure.
the best model, which we see kind of everywhere right now. But I think that's a great way to consolidate information. And then, like you said, too, a great manual dashboard,
Hmm.
it works. It can be customized, it can be
Yeah.
very simple,
Yeah.
but that takes a little bit more strategy from your team. But, once it's created, I think that's a great way to aggregate information. So that's probably
Hmm.
like what we usually suggest.
Yeah.
But most people, they have these systems and they don't really use them, at least to their full capacity.
Right. Yeah, you see that a lot. Yeah, go through a lot of effort of building out, let's just say, a dashboard again, and then because somebody's really an advocate of it and they're spearheading the project, and then they just can't get the buy-in to look at it every month or to maintain it, and then unfortunately, dies out.
And
But
it depends on who you are, right? Like I
sure.
love, personally, like I like Wrike, which is a project management tool,
Yeah.
Monday.com,
Hmm.
Google Sheets, right? Like
Yeah.
just I think any critical path software can be adapted for your use, right? And like
Yeah.
if you're not using it or you're not using one, even a homemade one on like a Google Sheet or something or an Excel, right? Like you really are allowing things to kind of like go with the wind, right? And not
Yeah.
having that structure. It's like the daily lineup. If you don't have an
Hmm.
agenda or meeting notes, sometimes there's no point to do the meeting
Yeah.
because, in the day you may feel like there's progress, but most people don't remember what you talked about on Monday on Friday.
Right.
Right. So if you don't have something to kind of like go back to,
Yeah. You
and
need
don't get
that
me wrong,
anchor.
it's difficult, right? Like day to day ops, you're coming in, the property
Hmm.
takes you in one direction and, employees take you in another, guests in another. And
Yeah.
people don't tend to have time to sit down for 5 or 10 minutes, but, that usually becomes kind of like the foundation of what you need.
Right.
Um, so that's usually our suggestion.
Yeah. Now, on the AI side, what are some of the exciting ways you're seeing it being used in hospitality?
I mean, like kind of what we discussed, like I think it's giving the smaller operator a real edge right now,
Hmm.
right? Like I think that the best way I've seen it used is to aggregate information. There's a
Hmm.
lot of information out
Yeah.
there and hospitality star reports, right? Like there's so many things that are available to us. And at a certain point, it used to be very expensive and very hard to get,
Right. Yeah.
right? And now, and I'll say this loosely, but almost anyone who wants to can. And that's just it's a game changer,
Yeah.
right? It really gives people an edge against the larger corporate kind of engines out there. And, I find that to be extremely exciting. I have this whole kind of movement, we call it deactivated hospitality, where it's using AI as a support structure and a resource, not a replacement.
Hmm.
Like we're already seeing people replace, call centers and
Sure.
reservationists and like things like that. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I think researchers, due diligence, maybe a little bit of copywriting will be taken over. I mean, it happens with every,
Hmm. Yeah.
form of new technology, but, seeing people replace positions with it, it makes sense in certain fields, AT&T, right? The banks,
Right.
things where, yes, you have a choice, but it's really not necessarily going to sway someone from a Wells Fargo to Chase, right?
Right. Right.
But,
Hmm.
in restaurants, you're calling and it's an AI bot and you get frustrated. Everybody knows the 15 zeros, right? Like you're just sitting there
Yeah. Yeah.
trying
I
to be
was
like, oh my God, I
keep
want to talk
yelling
to
into the
someone.
phone, operator, operator.
Representative,
Yeah.
right? Like, and in a restaurant, very easy. Hang up the phone, call
Yeah.
the next one, right?
Hmm.
And I think that has become challenging as well because people, obviously over the last few years, we've seen like institutional money coming into food and beverage and hospitality. And, they
Sure.
are looking to ways to increase margins, which, we totally understand. This is the hospitality business. But, I feel like the movement with AI is going to be, I've already seen my first one where someone said human led on an app.
Yeah.
And, it felt very Jetsons kind of like
Right.
iRobot, where you're almost apocalyptic, where you're like
Yeah. It's
human
very
led.
dystopian.
Yeah. You're
I
like,
saw this. It was a hotel in Japan. I was watching a video, and you walk in. There's nobody working at the front desk. It's all robotic and screens, and you check yourself in. It spits your key out. It just feels so dystopian. And
it's the convenient, right? It's
yeah,
like that. It's that and don't get me wrong. Listen, I think there's a time and a place for it.
yeah,
Like we're partners in a Moxie hotel, and they have, they do have check in, but they also have contactless, right, where you can go to a
hmm,
kiosk and
yeah,
check in. And listen, I totally understand some people, especially I think some of the younger generation. They're not as excited on interaction, right?
right,
and
Yeah, more about efficiency, I guess, right?
right, and that's fine, right? You don't want to talk to someone, or you've had a long trip. It makes total
Yeah,
sense. But I think when we talk about like our sector of lifestyle and luxury,
yeah.
luxury to us is it's being proactive to a
Hmm.
guest's need, right? It's being able
Hmm.
to like create this level, and some people don't like when we say it, but there's a level of servitude in hospitality, right? Like you really
Hmm.
have to put someone's wants and needs above yours in the moment. And
Yeah.
that's a very hard thing, I think, for people to adapt to. But, to do it in a way where as an owner or operator, you're not impacted and it's convenient,
Hmm.
almost takes away a level of it, right? Because one of the signs of hospitality is putting someone above yourself,
Yeah.
right? And it's like if you're doing that in an automated way, well, you're not really putting me above you. You're just creating a convenient way to make it
Yeah. You're putting
seem like that.
efficiency above
Right.
your guest.
And it's hard because sometimes it's not efficient.
Hmm.
AI, you know, it's kind of like when we talk about the hospitality business is, AI is artificial intelligence. It seems like it's intelligent because it's speaking to us or providing prompt and text to us in a way that we're familiar with,
Hmm.
right? Tone, verbiage, um, expression. So we feel like it's smart, right?
Yep.
And it's
Sure.
aggregating a lot of information and creating a common denominator of an answer. It's not creativity, right? It's actually the opposite. It's actually taking everything that it can research and then basically, I would say, dwindling or consolidating it
Hmm.
into one way for us, one answer for us to understand better, right? So when people use it for the creative side, you're like, well, it's actually the opposite of being creative. It's giving
Yeah.
you something that you may not be familiar with. So you
Right.
think it's creative and cutting edge, but it's
Yeah.
actually taking all the information of the past and giving it to you in a way that you can digest. Right. So it's
Yeah.
very
Exactly.
interesting to us to see people replacing the creative side of it with it. And I think that's the negative. But I guess to go back to your question, the exciting side is giving people an edge, giving people like a real chance to
Hmm.
compete at a level that they've never been able to for the cost that is available to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think on the creative side, the interesting point, and I'm seeing that, I mean, you may too. It depends on the size, especially in the restaurant space. Like smaller operators will lean into using AI tools because it's obviously much more cost efficient than hiring a graphic designer or marketing agency or what have you. But then we end up creating this whole world of like sameness. Like everybody's ad kind of looks the same. That looks like a generic a hamburger or a taco, and there's nothing really that makes it yours. But you got your post out there, so you
Yeah.
achieve that. So I don't know.
And I
I think
think that
we'll push
becomes,
back to a little bit more uniqueness at some point.
and I think, listen, I think that, again, it's knowing your market, right? Like
Yeah,
if you have a
exactly.
market who doesn't care, well, do
Yeah,
it. Like
yeah,
it's a great tool, right? But if you have one that does, they're, like I said, I guess in the beginning, like our guests are more educated now,
yeah,
right? And there's more competition and there's more options. And, I still think that like authentic hospitality is what creates real connection.
hmm,
And people are starting to feel it a little bit more. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's great to use AI to understand and help find your market. Like that's a
sure.
great
Yeah,
resource, right? It's a
yeah,
great
absolutely.
tool. But for it to necessarily connect with your market, I think that's where it becomes a little scarier.
Hmm.
And I guess, we're gonna
That's a good
see,
point.
right? And I
Yeah,
think
we'll
that,
see how it
we
plays out.
already have, right?
Yeah,
And I think that, the more the more we explore, I think, ways to use it. I mean, we use it a lot for, comp sets and analytics to get it
yeah,
faster, right? And
hmm,
to create a larger kind of pool. But, we've never used it like to create a strategy
right, exactly.
because
Yeah,
that's where I don't think, for example, an AI bot truly understands the difference between like New York and Boston, right?
yeah,
Let
the nuance.
alone Right. Let
it
alone
doesn't
like
get,
say, for example, New York, the West Village versus Soho,
yeah.
right? They look at volume, they look at per capita, they look at
Hmm.
density, they look at demographic, but they don't truly understand like the soul of these neighborhoods.
Right.
And that's what really makes, I think, the difference between a good venue and a great venue is like truly understanding your guest. And
Yeah,
right
absolutely.
now,
And know that that corner is always like the cursed spot that nothing can stay, business
yeah,
there.
100%.
Yeah.
We've seen funny ones. We had someone where I can't remember what it was. We had a gentleman, and what was he doing? He was writing an email, and it was something about, I think they were using something like prime location or prime something,
Okay.
and the AI confused it for prime steak, like prime meat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he wrote a response to the email, and it was obviously AI, and it said
Uh-huh.
something like, "Yeah, this sounds like a great dish to really, it's something." And we were talking about a location, right? So like, I read it, and I just reach out to him, and I'm like, "Listen, I think you need to you need to read your emails before you send them, right?
Yes.
Like, secondly, if you're going to use AI, you got to make sure that when you put in prime, it may not
It knows what
necessarily
you're
mean
talking
prime
about.
location. They think
Yeah.
that's like prime steaks." So you're already kind of seeing that kind of
Yeah.
happen, the call out, I think, in a way.
Yeah.
But,
Absolutely.
I think those who lean on it too much, we're going to see like how that ends up.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point there. So just going back before we run out of time today, I really want to get your perspective, beyond AI. What are you excited about in the hospitality industry as we look forward? Concepts, trends.
Um, I love seeing new emerging markets.
Yeah.
Like I'm very interested right now, like what's happening in Africa. I think it's just unbelievable. I think that the rise of, I guess I'd call it like the rural destination. I've
Mm-hmm.
always been like, the glamping, the
Yeah.
prefabs, right? The micro resorts. Like I think that's again very exciting, giving these smaller operators this real edge. We've seen glamping and rural sites commanding $500-600 ADRs, right? Which is
Yeah.
what, 5-star in the city we're getting, right? And I
Right.
think that is extremely exciting. I do like to see, which is debatable, but like I do like to see the lean within a little bit more ethnic cuisine happening.
Mm-hmm.
We're like DC, the formula of like opening a steakhouse, not the formula as much anymore. Boston, the
Right.
seafood restaurant. Like
Yep.
I think now we have created kind of an environment of real like exploration within culinary.
Mm-hmm.
That's exciting to me. I really love seeing what's happening right now within just overall sourcing and people really starting to like understand what some of these larger companies are doing to our food supply.
Yeah.
We've been an advocate of that for a while, and the whole Vital Farms kind of situation. I
Yeah.
spoke about this the other day, and I
Yes.
think like
Regenerative
the being
agriculture is
called out
coming
on the
up
grass fed
over and over.
meats. Yeah, and I think that's very exciting, right?
Yeah.
I think that
Mm-hmm.
it's going to take the masses to change it. And I think the trend of convenience really kind of masked a lot of that. And now people are saying, wait, slow down a second. Wait. What's in this? And like, how is that made? And you're marketing this as organic, but what does organic actually mean? And,
Right.
farm raised, explain that to me. Like, well, what does farm raised mean? And like, I think all of these questions are starting to kind of morph the way that people are looking at food. And,
Yeah.
I know that a lot of people, they blame the hierarchy, right? But I think
Mm-hmm.
people are really starting to realize no matter, how much marketing or, how much due diligence is done, if the people stop buying a product, the company closes. That's what happens, right? It does
Mm-hmm.
not matter what people say or do. If we stop buying something, they close.
Yeah.
And I think now people are starting to understand, wow, they're really, some of the things that are happening right now is not what we're looking for. It's not what we want. And that's become, I think for me, just like pretty exciting, right? Like the red dye #5 kind of outlaw, which
Sure.
I'm taking 3 years for whatever reason. But like,
It
that's a big step for the US. And I know
is.
that, some people get a little, pessimistic about it, but it has to start somewhere. right? And that's a big one.
Yeah.
That's because that goes after.
And you can see now, regardless of where, any rules or laws currently stand, like you do see larger companies starting to be proactive and saying, oh, we're taking it out, starting this year or whatever, next year, which I think is great because there's just that little bit of pressure pushing back for them to make these positive changes.
Yeah, it starts small, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It always does. So that's exciting. And I think, again, although, I'm still mixed reviews, I am excited about the way AI is going to help. Not maybe it's not my top 3.
Yeah.
But, I am excited about a lot of that technology. And I think that, like any technology, it's the people who use it, how they use it, the restrictions that are put in place against it. But, I'm excited that it's getting people a little bit more excited to jump in because they feel like they have a resource. And I think, going back to our very first, it's not their fault, right? Because our entire, that sector is gone, right? So they need something. They want something. People want confidence. And I think if AI can bring it, I think that's positive.
Sort of still a safe space to ask questions that maybe don't want to go ask somebody for fear of
help explain something that someone may feel listen, it's still hard to ask someone a question, right? So maybe just the first glance of can you explain this to me or whatever it is, and if that empowers people to dig in, I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, excellent. And I think there's a lot to look forward to. I know it's been such a big time of change, like I started off saying, but there is a lot of really interesting, bright spots. And those that are creative and know their numbers, I think, like you said, will come out on top in this.
Yeah, we hope so. And if not, listen, Barrel Age is an email away.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. So 2 last questions for you. First, so just share where people can find you and how they get a hold of you and they want more information.
We go old school. We always suggest going to our website because it does explain a little bit more of what it is we do. That's probably number 1.
Great. And we'll put the link down below in the comments and on the blog post that'll go along with this episode. And then Seth, my last question for you today. What has been your recipe to revenue in your business?
I think understanding the importance of delegation.
Excellent. I have not heard that one yet.
I think the importance of delegation and follow-up. You can't do it all yourself. How many people I've met where they say, for it to get done, I have to do it myself. And then we always say, well, who are the top 3 people you've given that opportunity to? And most of the time, the answer is no one, right? So I think that, we're in a challenging place. Our talent pool is small. It's obviously, hasn't grown over the last few years. But, I think there's some real passion out there. And I think we just have to take the time to mold people the same way that we were when we were kind of coming up in the industry. Yeah. And I think if you give someone the power or empower them and you delegate responsibility, and you can't just delegate, right? You got to delegate and then follow up, give critiques, mold people, mentor them. And I think that's the recipe.
Yeah. Be a mentor.
Because we can't do it forever.
No, that's true. And I think there's a great point there too of, as you bring other people into your process, and I am a recovering no delegator person, so I've come a long ways with it. But allowing those people to bring their point of view, especially if they're, let's say the younger generation, into that, because they're going to have a different perspective and maybe a better way to do it.
Sometimes to be surprised, right?
Yeah.
That's what it's about.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, Seth, thank you so much for joining us today on Recipe to Revenue. It's been great to have this conversation and very insightful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Recipe to Revenue. If you're building in the food, beverage, or hospitality space, you're in the right room. Subscribe for more founder stories and real-world growth strategies. And if this episode helped, share it with a friend and leave a review. It's how this show grows. For tools, templates, and ways to work together, visit recipe2revenue.co. I'm Leah Messina. Until next time, keep cooking up the next revenue stream.